So I'm Nate Kohn. I'm the director of the festival. This is our last panel of 4 panels that we had this year. And I thought that what we'd talk about, we've been talking about the digital revolution and social media and all that, and what's happening with movies in relationship to all that. I thought perhaps you've had enough of that, and we'll try to talk about something more Luddite today, which is really, the title of the panel is Choices, the movies we make, the roles we play. We're going to talk a little bit about the creative process, how these filmmakers and Hilde, I'll have a special question for you since you've not made a film, but you've been in a film. So what I'd like to do is just go down the panel, have each panelist introduce themselves to you, and then as they after they tell you their name and who they are, to talk about how they came, just a short sentence or two about how they came to make or participate in the project that they have the film that we have at the festival this year. So we'll start with Norman Jewison. The film here that he has here is entitled Only You. Norman?
Yeah, well, I started out a long time ago. I've been making movies for many, many years. And I think I never dreamed I would make movies. It was one of those things that happened in my life, fortunately. I started out in the theater, and then moved into film. But the film they're showing this year is Only You, and it's one of my romantic period films. It's about a girl who believes she's destined to find the man of her dreams, and coming from destino, from the Greek, to take a voyage. And she takes this voyage. And it also gave me the chance to make a film in Italy, which I'd always wanted to do with an Italian crew and with Sven Nykvist as the cinematographer. And my son, actually, as the camera operator. So there were a lot of reasons, personally, I wanted to make this film. But the most thing was about this girl's search for destiny, for her specific person. And she knew his name. Beforehand. So that's something. And it's really weird. It's a kind of a strange film, but it's filled with lots of surprises. And Robert Downey Jr. is in it, and it's one of those films that I've always treasured as a great experience.
Okay, Robbie.
My name is Robbie Pickering. I wrote my script for the film that I'm here for. I wrote it probably I guess 6 years ago now, and it came out. It went to South by Southwest, I guess in March, and you know, I wrote it at a time when my stepfather was dying, and I knew my mom would be alone for the first time in her life, and that really scared me. And you know, after writing it, you know, it was kind of a therapeutic process writing it, and afterwards I realized in writing it that it was me dealing with death for the first time. And yeah, it's a comedy, so and you'll have to excuse me. We all went karaokeing last night, and it was great, but man, 10:30 panel, that's crazy.
Yeah, your voice sounds a little rusty.
What's that?
Your voice sounds a little.
I know it.
What did you sing?
I sang Nothing But a G Thing by Dr. Emeritus, Dr. Dre, and Snoop Doggy Dogg.
It was fabulous, just by the way. I
was
just have to give him props.
It was the highlight of Ebertfest. Can say that.
Well, we might ask you to reprise that particular.
No.
Okay,
No.
we won't. Rachel, how'd you come? This is Rachel Harris. You can introduce yourself. Why'd you choose this film? How this happen? This film.
Hi, my name is Rachel Harris, and I am in the film Robbie's talking about, the film that he wrote about death that is a comedy. And I came about the film because I was lucky enough to get to read the script, and the role in and of itself, I think I talked about this on the other panel the other night, was something that I wanted to do immediately. I connected with it, but it was such a great role for a woman. I thought there's no way, because in getting movies made, a lot of times, especially with a small independent feature, you're going to go after a big name to try to get distribution for your film. And so I thought there's no way that I'm going to be attached to this because I'm not a big enough name, et cetera, and so forth. So so on and so forth. So somehow I got a meeting with Robbie. I believe in the beginning he didn't want to meet me. No. He thought I was he thought I was completely wrong for the role, and so we had a meeting, and that went very well. And we can get into this more later, but then I read for him, and I was really happy to get to do that, and then it ended up working out.
Let's go to Jen Arnold, then Patti, then Hilde, and so because you'll find out why later.
Catching me. Oh, what do I do to make this work? There we go. You're catching me by surprise. I was zoning out there. I am Jennifer Arnold. I'm the director and one of the producers of a documentary called A Small Act, which Patti produced and shot, and Hilde is in, which is why they're throwing to me to go first. The film premiered at Sundance last year and has sort of taken over all of our lives. And we ended up doing it because we heard this fantastic story about a Kenyan man who, when he was a boy, he couldn't afford to go to school, but he was sponsored by a total stranger who's Hilde, and 25 years later decides to find her and thank her for sponsoring him. So once we heard the story, we knew we had to make it, and took off from there.
Yeah.
Patti?
I don't think I had a choice. I was just, Jen told me about it, and we knew that Chris, who's the guy in the film, was going to go meet Hilde for her 85th birthday, and so we, in a few months' time, and so we kind of went immediately into production, and so we didn't really have that much time to think about it. We just did it.
Yes, I told Patti, you're shooting a film, we start in 3 months, I don't have money, you're doing it for free.
And you're helping me produce.
Yes, and you're helping me produce. And I think she must have been tired or something, and she just went, what? Okay. And then I said, no, you said you'd do it.
Hilde, why don't you tell us how you came to sponsor this child? This is Hilde Bach. She's come all the way from Sweden to be with us.
I have been teaching in a teacher college in Sweden, in a town called Västerås, 120 kilometers from Stockholm. We have a university there too, but only about 15,000 students. And then I think it's in the beginning of 17th, our headmaster, he was in Kenya, and working for the organization there, and then he missed a son in an accident in Nairobi, outside Nairobi somewhere. And then when he came home, he started this thing to sponsor children in Negeva. It is a small village outside Nairobi. And so we were nearly all teachers, and even also a lot of students sponsored children. And I think it was not so much money in the beginning, but then the money was being bigger. So it was not an organization, it was a private thing from this headmaster. So, but not all of the teachers and students they could have known the name of the children, but I get a name. And in the beginning, I was corresponding with his sister because he couldn't speak any English in the beginning. And so that was the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Paul Fierlinger, whose film you saw yesterday.
Yes, hi, I'm Paul Fierlinger. I think I started a couple of years before Norman did, so he might be pleased to know that he's not the oldest one here. Everything I did, any film I've made in all my life was motivated by fear. I've been an independent all my life. I never worked for a studio. I never had a job. And I'm always worried where my next film is going to come from. I would have sometimes, when I worked for Sesame Street, I would have as many as 25 films in production at the same time, and I was still scared where the next one is going to come from when these are done. And some of the years proved to be proved that my worries were not totally misleading. There were times when Sandra and I, there was one particular time when Sandra and I didn't have any work at all for 2 years. So that's what's motivated me. So when our producers called us out of the blue and asked us if we would be interested in making a feature film, a theatrical feature, which was the first for us, and that we can make it about anything we want to, that instantly what went through my head is, where is the largest audience base that we could make an interesting film for so that we could make some money on it? It's always that, always that fear of how to sustain a living. So dogs was a natural answer. We had just finished, Sandra and I had just finished a very successful film for PBS called Still Life with Animated Dogs, and it was all about dogs. We were told by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that it was the most aired film in the history of public broadcasting. And something like that doesn't give me so much a sense of pride as a sense of relief. So there I hit it. So it's dogs, and this is what we told the producers. We said, well, we had success with a dog film, and then they said, that sounds good. So do you have any book in mind? They wanted us to do it based on a book. These two producers were even older than I am, and they make all their decisions based on formula, on old formula. An independent film is going to be successful if it's based on a famous book, if it has famous voices in it, but they never thought of something like, and if it has a famous animator. Animators aren't famous, so. It's always the voices are famous, not the animators. So the Tulip, J.R. Ackerley's book came to mind right away because the first time I read it, I thought this would make an excellent film for us, an animated film. We're always looking for material that couldn't be said as well, couldn't be told as well in any other form than animation. There has to be a good reason, besides being able to sell itself, why it should be told in animation. So I think that's how we work.
David?
Hi, I'm David Call, and I'm one of the actors from Tiny Furniture, which screened last night. I guess how I got involved with that was I met Lena Dunham, the writer-director and star of the film, at a mutual friend's birthday party, and I had just directed a short film and needed an editor, and so we were chatting. I mentioned that, and Lena was like, "Oh, well, my office mate is an editor. You should talk to her." And so I ended up, the film ended up being cut by this girl, Sarah Rosane, who shared an office with Lena and also with Greta Gerwig, the actress. And so I just ended up hanging out in their office a lot while we were cutting and hanging out with Lena. And then we became friends, and then a few months went by, and then she called me and said, "Hey, I wrote a part for you in this movie that I'm gonna do." And I opened the script, and like half the dialogue was some conversations that we actually had, and and she called to ask me if, told me she wrote the part for me, and then she said, and I was like, "What is it?" And she says, "You're a pot-smoking, porn-obsessed chef who has sex with me in a pipe." I was like, "All right, great." I have one request. I was like, "What's that?" She says, "A girl mustache." I'm like, "Done." So that's how I got involved with that movie.
Norman, you've made a very eclectic collection of motion pictures over the years. One of your early films, I guess, was In the Heat of the Night, which was the first film of Scott Wilson. Those of you who have been with us know that he's a friend of this festival and has been here, I think, 3 or 4 times. But I mean, what attracts you to a particular project, and which ones come to you, and which ones do you actually initiate from the very beginning yourself, and how's that process work?
Well, essentially, I'm just a storyteller. Storytellers have existed since the beginning of the human race. There's nothing better than hearing a good story. And if you can tell it with believability, and I think that's what films are about. It's about suspending belief in the darkness for an hour or so, and telling a story where people feel something. Fear, love, tears. Life is full of joy and sadness. And so every story I tell has to have a raison d'etre for being there. So it's the idea behind the work of art that's interesting. It's always the idea behind the painting that attracts you to the painting. And sometimes you don't know why you like this painting so much. And you discover that the artist was trying somehow to perpetuate an idea. And so that's what I think films are about. They're about ideas. They're about, and that's why they can have a tremendous effect on the audience and on our lives. And that's all timing. Bobby Kennedy once told me when I was doing In the Heat of the Night, and I happened to meet him in a ski resort in Sun Valley, and he said, I told him a quick story. "What do you do?" he said. "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a filmmaker." "Oh, what kind of films do you make?" So I told him very quickly, in 2 minutes, the story of In the Heat of the Night, which was a film I was just starting. And he stopped and he says, "This could be a very important film, Norman." Timing is everything in life and in art and in politics. Timing is everything. And of course, at that time, America was going through a tremendous civil rights revolution. Cities were burning down all over the country, and I was making this film about tolerance, about a white man and a black man. And so I wasn't too happy about, I wasn't too enthusiastic about how it was going to be received, but Bobby was right.
So did you ask Bobby what he did? Let's let's you know, I know you're not ready, Robbie, but let's.
No, I'm
you
good.
told us a little bit about how you came to the idea, but what's your background? I mean, how did you get into filmmaking in the first place, and are you going to keep doing it?
No, after this, I'm going straight into computer programming. I want to keep making more films quickly. But I went to NYU. I've been wanting to direct since. I think when I was a kid, I was growing up in Houston. You know, I didn't know a lot about movies. Nobody in my family worked in movies. Nobody I knew worked in movies. So I think I always thought the actors made the movies. I think to me when I was
They don't.
What
They
hey,
do.
but I thought that they, I didn't really. I mean, of course, I was conscious of celebrity and all that, but I, you know, I don't know. I kind of thought they made them up, and then I think at some point, I think the first time I became conscious of a director was when I liked these this series of films. I flipped over, and my parents couldn't figure out why I loved them so much, and it was Tucker Man in His Dream, Rumblefish, Peggy Sue Got Married especially, and The Outsiders, and I think this film geek, the only other film geek at my high school, told me that those were all made by the same guy, and that's why I think that's why I was responding to those post-apocalypse Coppola films, even Cotton Club, things like that. Like, he's doing something interesting and he's creating a certain world, and I think I responded to that. So I became conscious of a director, started reading Roger a lot. Watched more films that I would have never seen without his kind of guidance. And then knew I wanted to be a director, went to NYU, did a bunch of crappy short films, and then started writing. So that's kind of how I got here.
Yeah. So, but then you studied. I mean, you studied these films and
Yeah.
came to it from that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also, you know, once I got to college, I started really concentrating on writing because I was such a shitty director at the beginning, you know, and there were better kids doing better work than me, and we had kind of a silent film class, which I think is great, but I just started out pretty poor. I think I was experimenting with things, and I was so bad at the beginning that nobody was concentrating on writing. So, and I was pretty good at the writing part, so I got better at directing, but I mainly concentrated on writing at NYU, and you know, then by the time I was making short films for real, you know, I think they were a little better than the other kids because they actually had decent scripts and stuff like that.
Yeah, I teach writing among the other things I do, and if you're a good writer, you know.
I don't think that's one problem I have with film schools. I don't think they really
concentrate. No, they don't concentrate on the writing at all.
No, it's
many
kind
of them
sad.
don't, and that's the problem with the films.
Yeah.
We'll go to Jennifer. You make documentaries, but your documentaries have to tell a story, right? And back to Norman's point about storytelling. So how do you find the topics, the subjects that interest you?
Well, I also went to film school, and I wanted to be a filmmaker since I was young, but I had this idea when I was a teenager that I didn't want to be a boring filmmaker, so I wanted to have an exciting life. This was, maybe I was like 12 or 13 when I made this decision, and that eventually led to me wanting to study abroad from a pretty young age. So I went to University of Nairobi for my year abroad as an undergraduate, and I met, Chris is one of the main subjects in the film. I met his cousin, and she had been sponsored, and I stayed in touch with her, and I was trying to sponsor a student. So that's how I ended up hearing the story. But you do have to go through a writing process with documentaries as well. You're just sort of writing a fantasy thing where you're writing what you think is going to happen, and you structure it in a regular 3-act structure, and then you go shoot it, nothing happens that you think will happen. You have to start over and write again. But it's sort of the same thing. If you can't sit down and write a good story on paper, you're not going to end up with a good story on film, even if it's real people and documentary. So it's a similar process, but you don't have to spend as much time sitting there alone writing. I'm really bossy. I like to boss around people. I don't like to sit by myself. There's no one to boss around. So I didn't think I would go into documentary, but it was fear of writing that probably threw me into documentary instead of having to spend so much time writing that script.
But with documentary, you never know what's going to happen, and the story can lead you in a whole other direction sometimes.
No, it's true. You have to constantly readjust, but I still think you have to, on paper, be able to say, this is a film about this theme, and then have some idea of what your act breaks might be. And then if people, they're real people, they're going to do whatever they do. You can't control it. If they do something that you weren't expecting, or the story goes into a totally different direction, even if you only have a few hours, you still have to sit down on paper and be like, wow, this wasn't what I was thinking, and think of it as a film again. If you don't, I guess that's what I do. I don't think all documentary filmmakers do that, but I did start out thinking I was going to be a narrative filmmaker, so I think structurally, that's how my brain was trained originally.
Okay. Patti, I don't know if Haji's made several appearances at this film festival. You all remember Haji's film, Somebody's. We did turn that into a television series for BET that we shot a couple years ago. And Patti was our director of photography on that series. And she's done a lot of work in television, Bernie Mac show, and she's done a couple things recently that I don't know the name of. But how did you like moving from the role of DP to the role of producer?
Well, it was actually really interesting because you make different choices. As a DP, you're trying to think extremely creative about things, and that's all you're really thinking about. As a producer, you have this whole other thing where we're trying to figure out what to do very practically. We had a very small budget to make the movie, and we were shooting in places mostly that didn't have electricity, where there might have been only one window in the entire place, and so, you form a different challenge of like, how are we going to get all of our gear there? How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to do this? And so, instead of just being the cinematographer where I'd, say, we need this, 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 and this, I was the one that actually had to go get that stuff. So it really, changes your view on how to approach things and how to make it all work. And what was really nice was being able to see everything through from beginning to end and have that satisfaction of making this movie and having a little bit more ownership of it, of being really proud of what the end product is. And it's definitely a lot more personal.
Okay. Let's ask our actors. I mean, both of you have done work in television, and you've done work in feature films. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how those processes differ, if they do. Rachel, you want to start? Or David, you want to start?
Okay. I guess they differ. TV is, I mean, I've worked a lot in TV. It just moves faster. You're on a much tighter, like, you know, if you're doing I guess I've never done a sitcom, but if you're doing an hour long, you know, you basically have 8 days to shoot, and you generally have multiple cameras going. The crew, if it's a show that's been on for a while, it's a crew that's worked together for a long time, and it's a very quick process. You just kind of show up. You might get rewritten scenes the night before. You might get rewritten scenes the day you show up. You just kind of walk into a room. They usually know exactly what they're going to do. They're like, okay, camera's going to go here. You're going to stand there. You're going to walk in, and let's get it. And I mean, you know, there's obviously variation in this, and some directors and some shows are different, but generally it's a pretty precise, quick thing, which can be great because it sort of forces you to think on your feet and be prepared and move very quickly. Film, on the other hand, and obviously there depends on the shoot, but I think there tends to be a little bit more concentration and a little bit more care taken with it. You know, if you're lucky, you'll have a rehearsal process. You get to spend time with the script, sometimes a month or 2 months, and if you're really lucky, you get to spend like a month or two with the script preparing, you know, figuring everything out. When you show up on set, there seems to be a little bit more exploration, a little more leeway for figuring things out. The DP and the director, you know, you generally have it figured out, but you know, there's more flexibility, and so it can be, yeah, you have more preparation, and there's a little more time and a little more care taken with every scene and every shot, because this is the only chance you're going to get to do this scene. Whereas on a TV show, you know, you're going to do an interrogation scene next week and the week after and the week after that, and, you know.
Okay, Rachel?
I think the difference for me with television and film is that with TV again, you do move much more quickly. But I think that's what's interesting about things from a writing and creative process is that when I did the feature with Robbie, he wrote it, he directed it, he had a vision for the film, and he knew the characters better than any of the actors. A lot of times what happens when you're on a television show, you have multiple writers, and then you have multiple directors. And so keeping the tone of the show, keeping the tone of the characters and making sure that they stay true to that is a little bit trickier, which is great in its own way. Like, it's great to try to, stay within those parameters. But I do feel like you have more of a community on a film. It's like you all set up shop and you're this little, you're kind of in a bubble on a film. Whereas on a television show, let's say you're doing a sitcom, like a multi-camera, do you guys know the difference between like a multi-camera sitcom and a single camera sitcom? One is shot with one camera, there's one's on a sound studio, one's on location. So when you're doing the multicam, you spend 2 hours a day and then you go home and you have a regular life. Like if you have kids, or a dog, you just every day you're in and out of character. Whereas when you're working on a feature, you sort of get to be in that character, 5 days. We did 6-day shoots, 6-day a week shooting, so it's just different. And they're both great. It's great to be working, and especially when you have good material. So it's just a technical difference.
TV feels more like a job, whereas a film tends to be more like immersive, creative experience. You're sort of away somewhere. Whereas TV, come in and punching your clock every day and going home, which can be nice.
Unless you were like
Yeah, well, unless
you're working with really great people.
Yeah,
like
I mean, yeah.
great writers.
Yeah,
Stuff like that.
Yeah, sometimes you get lucky.
Which I have. Sadly, he hasn't.
No.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Teasing.
I've worked with wonderful TV writers and directors, and they're great people.
We got.
So, are you interested in moving more toward feature films? I think migration in the business is interesting. Used to be people started out in television and they tried to get into feature films, and now feature film directors who have a reputation tend to be moving toward TV. So, where do you want to end up?
Well, I mean, for me, I've always wanted to, features has always sort of been the goal. I mean, movies are the reason that I got into acting, was watching a lot of films. I mean, I've worked a lot in TV. I'm not at all opposed to it, but I've never been like a regular on a show where you're actually under contract for multiple years. I don't think that I could handle that. What I like about acting and filmmaking is that you can go, you know, you sort of a professional dilettante, and I get to spend 2 months. Like I just did a movie where I played a priest, so I spent like 2 months like learning how to be a priest and talking to priests and reading books, and then we went and shot it for like a month and a half, and it was sort of all about that. And now I'm done, and I'm moving on, and I might do something this summer. I play photographer, so I'm gonna go start learning about like large format photography and go down south. And so for me, I like the variety and the change that comes with making features, and sort of the idea of being locked into like playing the same character with the same people for like 5, 6 years, 8 months out of the year is just not. It's really not in my nature. But of course, if something, some amazing TV show came along, then I would by all means take it. But features are sort of what I love.
Okay. Why don't we start opening it up to questions? If anybody has a question they want to ask anyone on the panel or the panel as a whole, there's a microphone in the front of the room, or in the middle of the room, I guess. So, anyhow, while people are lining up or not, here comes the question.
Good morning, everyone. My question is for Mr. Jewison. I missed the earlier part of this presentation, so I'm very sorry if this was already addressed. I'm also Canadian, which is why I just apologized. I wanted to ask you about Jesus Christ Superstar. The theme is choices, and a long time ago I wrote an essay for a class on Jesus Christ Superstar, and I noticed a visual theme of chess, and I don't know if it's actually in there or not, but one thing I'd like to know from you directly is a little bit about the choices that were made with regards to the costumes, especially the priesthood, because that's where I found the chess theme to be most prominent. And also a little bit about the way that certain scenes were blocked, because in certain areas, Jesus, who was dressed in white, was up against the priesthood, and they were all in black. And maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I figure choices were definitely made, and I'd like to know a little more about them.
Yeah. Every film that you make, you see the film in your own mind, your mind's eye. So that's why the director can explain to actors and to prop men and to set designers and to cameramen what they see, what film they're making. And because it's in your mind, in your imagination, it sometimes conjures up images that you get locked into. So I think in Jesus Christ Superstar, I was making a rock opera, So there is only one line of dialogue in the film. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's the only line of dialogue. Everything else are songs and lyrics. So it's about the good, the bad, and the beautiful. It's a rock opera, that's all it is. It's not a big biblical treatise I was making. So I was making this musical. And so therefore, when it came to costuming and style and period, what period are you dealing with? Well, we're dealing with today. That's why I put tanks and planes and guns into the film, because they're contemporary. The work itself is contemporary, written by two young Englishmen. So when it came to costuming, I was trying to do a mixture of biblical and contemporary. That's the only thing I can say, because when it came time to make the film, I started to roam around the Holy Land where the story originally took place. And I guess that's what affected me more than anything. And I was just listening to a Walkman, walking around singing to myself and trying to visualize. And I didn't want to build big temples and places. I wanted to find them organically, because I felt that this is what's left of the Holy Land. These are the rocks and earth and so on, so the people walked on. So I think that was it. I tried to give the Romans always a look of the helmets. I tried to give the other characters, I tried to give them an indication of period, but on top of that, it was all contemporary. We had T-shirts and things, and I don't know, it was a mixture, and so it's hard for me to describe it, because it was many years ago when I was much younger, and I was out on the desert in 120 degrees, so I was a little out of it, I guess. But
with visions of Bobby Kennedy dancing in your head.
Well, and I was working with a Canadian choreographer, as a matter of fact, Robbie, and the cast were Israeli, British, American, French, they were all mixed up. They were just a bunch of kids. They were gypsies. And then, of course, I had some great singers. But it's an interesting look. The picture does have an interesting look. And I like the look very much. I really think it works for that particular.
Okay. Next question.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Jewison, I'd like to just follow up on what Olivia asked. Was it a conscious decision to follow Fiddler with Jesus Christ Superstar, or?
Well, I decided that I better do one for the Goyim.
All right.
All my life, the first line of my book, I wrote an autobiography some years ago, and this crazy business has been good to me. This terrible business has been good to me. And the first line of that book is, as long as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a Jew. Because my name is Jewison, and son of a Jew. And I was called Jew boy and Jewy all my life. So don't talk to me about discrimination, please. The fact is, I'm not Jewish. It's not my fault. My family comes from Yorkshire. And I have no idea of why we ended up being called Jewison. But if we were assimilated, it was around 1215. So I can trace my family back a number of years.
All right, wonderful, thanks.
Rod?
Mr. Jewison, you've done a lot of excellent, unparalleled work regarding social justice and the African American experience. How did that happen? Soldier Story, Hurricane, Heat of the Night. How did that happen, and did you have to fight to get those movies made?
Well, I think my impression of America goes back to when I was 15 years old, because I am Canadian and very proud of it. And I was taken to Niagara Falls, New York. And like most Canadian kids, there's a bridge, the Rainbow Bridge. And it's fun to go in the middle of the bridge and put 1 foot in Canada, 1 foot in America. Because the United States was, our impression of it was in movies. It wasn't even television then, but it was through advertising, we had this image that America was more fun than Canada. And we were probably right. But our country, both countries are very old as far as North America goes, and we do share a common history and a common geography. So, but we have a totally different political system. And we don't have in Canada the tremendous immigration that America went through. So when I got to the border, I walked over into the United States, and the first thing I saw was a cop, and he had a gun. And I had never seen a gun. Because the police in Canada they carry a gun, but it's in a black thing and it's all covered. You can't see it. So like any 7-year-old boy, I was totally fascinated. And I saw this gun, and it was hanging out of his holster, and it had a wooden handle that was all polished. And I said to him, "Mister, can I touch your gun?" And he said, "Well, sure, kid." And I reached out my little hand, and I felt this gun. And to me, that was power. And it was like a cowboy. And that was my first image of America, was this cowboy. He was, you know, a policeman in Niagara Falls, New York or something, just leaning against the... And so I had this image of power, and I guess I had this image of black citizens not being given the same shot, because this was many, many years ago when I was very young, and I'm very old now. So I guess I got caught up in this. When I was 17 years old, I hitchhiked through the States in a Canadian Navy uniform because you could get a lift so much quicker if you had a uniform on. Because it was right after the war. "Oh, you served in the war. Like, come on, jump in." So it was one of those things. And so I wore my uniform. And I had this funny little British Navy uniform on. And I was very young. I was 18, 19. And I got to a town in the south, in Sykeston, no, it was in Tennessee. And it was a very hot day, and I'd been hitchhiking, and I was south of Memphis, and I had my sea bag, and the sweat was rolling down my face, and a bus came along. So I put my hand up, because I knew that if you were in uniform, you traveled on a bus for nothing. So the guy stopped, I got on the bus, and I went and sat down. I sat down in the back because it was hot, and the windows were open at the back. And the bus moved about 8 feet and stopped. And then the guy says, "Are you trying to be funny, sailor?" And I looked up, and I could see him looking at me in the mirror, the driver. And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Can't you read the sign?" And I looked up, and here was a hand-painted sign. Hand-painted. Somebody had painted that sign. And it was hanging with a little piece of wire. It was like this. It wasn't a big sign, small sign. And it said, "Black people to the rear." And I'd never seen anything like that. And I was sitting there, and there was 3 or 4 black people around me. And then I looked up, and I saw some white people in front of the bus. And I thought to myself, who would put up a sign like that? That's not right. So I didn't know what to do. I was confused. I got up, and I got off the bus. And I never forgot it. So that's why I made a lot of films about that subject.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have 2 totally different questions. I would like to thank Norman for making Only You, and I actually have a copy of it because I am one of the single girls that believe when I go to Italy this summer, that guy's gonna be there finally. So thank you for giving us romance, never giving up on it. Then from an acting standpoint for Rachel and David, being a fellow actor, just curious, what do you identify with? Are you a Udo Hagen fan? Are you Meisner? Are you Sherlock? Just curious, you know, what you relate to as far as acting.
Oh, well, I know that for, I studied acting at a Bachelor of Fine Arts from school in Ohio.
Holy crap.
What?
There's a migration going on.
Migration.
I think there's probably.
I think they have a bus waiting.
A bus waiting, yeah.
Oh, this bus.
There's a bus.
There's a bus.
No problem. That's okay.
It's okay. We still love you very much.
I don't want to hear what I.
She reminds me of my mother.
I mean, it's all
She
you.
looked like my mother. The woman apologized.
You should let's stick to the subject.
Oh, sorry. 1 second.
Okay.
I was.
I think there
I'm
still are
just
some
waiting,
people who
I'm
want to hear the answer to the question. So.
Yeah.
I know. Oh, yes. No, I know. I'm just waiting, giving people a moment.
Yeah.
So the technique that I was trained at was we did Stanislavski, Udo Hagen. I studied a lot of Spoling. You know, like we did all of the children's exercises and things like that. You know, I didn't do any Meisner until I graduated from college and went to New York and started studying with a great acting guy named Louis Sheeter. And then I studied with Larry Moss in Los Angeles, and I work with a coach now. But for me, it's sort of like a little bit, for me it's kind of like I take a little bit of something from everything. And yeah.
I studied at the Atlantic Theater Company, which is David Mamet and William H. Macy's company. I started there for 2 years, and Mamet's whole approach is very dry and very analytical, which was good in one sense, in that it taught you to break down a script like very quickly, and each scene, you know, you can break it down, but it's very much lacking in imagination and like artistic license, and so then. actually at Atlantic, I had a couple teachers who were very much Meisner-based. I mean, not Meisner-based, what am I saying? Adler-based, and were very much about character and imagination. And I also had some teachers that came from like physical theater, like Grotowski and the National Theater of Tokyo and stuff like that. So then after Atlantic, I studied with some Meisner guys, Earl Gister, some amazing teacher in New York. And now it's like a grab bag. Like I had to stop going to acting school, and now I just sort of follow my instinct. And then if I come up against a problem or I can't figure a scene out or I'd feel stuck, then I can sort of go back and think like, oh, okay, maybe I need to work on this or work on that. And each role is different too. Some stuff requires a lot more work and a lot more imagination. Other stuff's pretty straightforward, and you're like, okay, I get this.
Get all those old tapes from Sandy Meisner. That's what you should do.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing really quickly?
No.
Okay. No, I studied, I think since I had all that training, but I think one thing that's really helped me a great deal is I studied with the Groundlings Theater, and the learning to improvise was great as far as how it affected everything else, but also it just gave me, what I say a lot is that it taught me to be fearless, like not afraid, like to just make a choice, even if it's a wrong choice. It informs you, especially if you get a rehearsal process.
Yeah.
So, but the improv, I think it's really important to take some sort of improv classes for dramatic work as well as comedy.
And if you can find Sidney Pollack's Meisner documentary, it's amazing. It's from like the 80s. You see the man himself.
We'll have one final question.
Yeah, it's just a comment. I came from Australia many years ago, and I remember coming into Hawaii, and I thought the policeman was a cartoon character, and I took photographs of him from many directions before I realized that he was for real. And I have had since then many of the same sorts of experiences that you were talking about.
Okay. I just wanted to ask Hilde one final question. I wanted to ask you what your next movie is going to be.
What's your next movie that you're going to be in?
I think this was the first and the last time I have been acting in the movie.
I don't know about that.
It was very interesting to be in the movie, but I think I have never been it before, and I think I never do it again.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all the panel for taking time to be with us this morning, and thank you for attending. We'll see you at the rest of the movie.